An original.
From Story Studio Network.
Welcome to The Fatigue Fixer, the podcast where we get real about why you're so tired and what you can do about it. Every 2 weeks, we'll gather here for honest, heart-to-heart conversations about reclaiming your energy, your patience, and feeling truly at home in your body. I'm Dr. Sarah Vadeboncoeur, a naturopathic doctor, Menopause Society certified practitioner, Enneagram 3 entrepreneur with enough business ideas to last me 10 lifetimes, and a hockey and baseball mom. Over the past 15 years, I've helped thousands of women just like you cut through the confusion and finally feel like themselves again. And now, I want to hear from you too. Use the link in the show notes below to leave me a voicemail, to share your story, give feedback on an episode, ask a question, or tell me what's been exhausting you. And your voice might even make it onto the show. Together, we'll get to the root of what's really draining your energy and give you the tools, clarity, and encouragement you need to fix your fatigue. I hope you enjoy today's episode. Welcome back to The Fatigue Fixer. One of the things that's fascinating is to see what the trends are over the years in health and wellness. And I can always tell what's trending online by the kinds of things that women come in asking about. So a few years ago, almost every woman came in thinking she had a thyroid problem. She rarely did, but that's what everybody was convinced of. And now it's cortisol, right? Everyone thinks they have cortisol. Parasites are still very popular. And definitely the number one thing that everyone is convinced of, even if they're very young, is that they are in perimenopause. And while those things are sometimes to blame, the thing that is usually going on that very few people have on their radar is insulin resistance. And insulin resistance isn't just a blood sugar problem, it's an energy problem. So what is insulin resistance? Maybe you've heard that term, you've heard of insulin, but you're not really sure what the heck it means. I think the simplest way to think about insulin resistance is that it's prediabetes. So it is what happens before prediabetes. And it is a path that you don't want to be on because diabetes doesn't come on overnight. It's often decades in the making. And that journey begins with insulin resistance. So what is insulin? Insulin is a peptide, it's a hormone, and it is an energy shuttle. So under normal conditions, insulin works to keep your blood sugar somewhere around 4.8, which is the equivalent of having about a teaspoon of sugar in your whole bloodstream. Now, when you eat, your blood sugar goes up, which is perfectly normal, and we'll talk about more. But when blood sugar goes up, insulin is released. And insulin is there to help bring your blood sugar back down to somewhere around 4.8. And the way that it does that is that insulin takes glucose from your blood and brings it to your cells. So one of the first places it goes to deposit glucose is your brain, because your brain uses 20% of your daily total energy consumption. Your brain is a very energy intensive organ because it does a lot of things. And I just need to say this, despite what the keto people tried to convince us of, your brain's primary preferred source of energy is glucose. So after insulin takes glucose to the brain, it's going to go to the other parts that need glucose. And one of the other big pieces that needs glucose is your muscle. So your muscle is like this giant sink or giant sponge for glucose. And this is a huge part of the problem with insulin resistance because we lose muscle as we age. And despite the fact that there's been a huge push for strength training, which is wonderful, sadly, only about 40% of women in North America meet the recommended 150 minutes or more per week of moderate intensity exercise. So most of us are not exercising enough. And then on top of that, most of us have desk jobs. We sit around all day long and our muscles really don't need that much glucose because they're not doing anything other than sitting. Blood sugar goes up, insulin comes out, takes that sugar to your brain, your muscles, your liver, your heart. And then any glucose that is left over, that is kind of extra, that your muscles don't need and any other part doesn't need, that gets converted into fat and that gets stored for a rainy day. Some of it gets stored in your muscle, some of it gets stored in your liver. And so what insulin resistance means is that your cells are not responding properly to insulin. So in order to keep your blood sugar in check, your body is pumping out more and more insulin because it's taking more and more insulin to keep your blood sugar in that normal range. Now, if you listen to episode 49, which is the one where you're in energy debt, and listening to that episode, you realized, ooh, my body is pretty tired, my brain is pretty tired, you need to be thinking about insulin resistance. Because insulin resistance is like your body working overtime to try to deposit energy, right? To try to get glucose into those cells, but your cells are not accepting the payment, right? They won't accept the deposit. So you can have lots of fuel or glucose available, but you still feel exhausted because it can't get into your cells where it's actually needed, and it's hanging out in your bloodstream, which is where it causes damage. One of the things that I want to clear up, because this is a question I get all the time, and this is something I see all the time online, is this idea of like blood sugar spikes. And the word spike, I think, is used intentionally because it sounds bad and it creates fear and worry in people. Now, your blood sugar is supposed to go up after you eat. That is perfectly normal. It's not a spike unless it actually goes way out of the range. But having your blood sugar go up after you eat is perfectly normal. That's how your body gets energy, right? You need that glucose in your blood for it to go to your brain and your heart and your muscles. But this normal phenomenon has been weaponized, sadly, like a lot of things get weaponized in wellness, into this thing that we need to fear, that's abnormal, that is going to cause all kinds of problems. And this is where we see people wearing continuous glucose monitors, which are these sensors that you attach usually on your upper arm, and it measures your blood sugar 24 hours a day. Now, this is very helpful for people who have prediabetes and diabetes. It could also be helpful for people who have insulin resistance. But for people who do not, what I've seen, and this happened to me when I wore one as a test, is what it does for most people is it just creates worry and panic around normal rises in blood sugar after people eat. So if you've been contemplating getting a CGM and you don't have blood sugar issues, it's probably not going to be helpful. It might actually just create more fear and anxiety, again, around something that's perfectly normal. So why are we talking about insulin resistance, right? Why does this matter? It matters because your blood sugar has a huge influence on your energy. A lot of the stuff that we see happen with blood sugar comes from people who have diabetes. So this may not all happen in insulin resistance, but it gives us a lot of clues as to the connection between blood sugar and fatigue. If we start with your body energy, right? When body energy levels are low, we have physical fatigue, right? Our body feels heavy, it feels slow, it feels hard to get up and go for that walk. What's happening here is that fluctuations in blood sugar levels can impact your energy levels. So you can have moments where you have really high levels of blood sugar. You may have moments where you have low levels of blood sugar or hypoglycemia. And then you also have the fluctuation, right? So how big is the difference between your high blood sugar and your low blood sugar? And the more that goes up and down, and the more often that goes up and down, irrespective of your overall blood sugar. So no matter what your overall blood sugar is, the more kind of big ups and downs you have, that can contribute to fatigue. We also know that one of the things that goes hand in hand with insulin resistance is often obesity and overweight. And that has also been linked to higher levels of fatigue. And then the other thing that's happening in insulin resistance is that you're having higher levels of inflammation. And those inflammatory molecules can also cause a lot of fatigue. And then because most people who have overweight or obesity or blood sugar issues often don't feel great, they're tired and they don't feel good, they often aren't moving as much. So it creates this vicious cycle where people don't feel good, they're tired, they don't move, and that makes them even more tired. It creates this vicious cycle. When we look at your brain energy, right? And this is something I know I struggle with and a lot of women struggle with, right? It's like, why can't I remember everything? I keep saying the wrong word. I know the word I'm thinking of, but I can't, I describe it. You know that thing that looks like that thing? If you're having that, you have mental fatigue, which sadly a lot of us do. And blood sugar contributes to that as well. So if you have episodes where your blood sugar is too high, that is associated with diminished cognitive function, aka your brain doesn't work as well, and altered mood, right? So you're going to feel it in your brain, you're going to feel it in your mood, and that includes more fatigue. If we look at what happens after someone is more hypoglycemic, where their blood sugar drops, people have more fatigue, they don't feel good, and even the next day, they're more likely to feel tired during exercise than if their blood sugar levels are in a normal range. And then if we go back to the glucose variability, so again, that's like, what's the difference between your low and your high? And the more variability there is in there, that can also cause a lot of mental fatigue. How does blood sugar cause fatigue? What's actually going on? So again, you've got these blood sugar swings. So often you'll get kind of a high, and then that might be followed by a crash. That can definitely cause fatigue. Those cells, right, your brain cells, your heart cells, your muscle cells are not able to access the glucose, which is the fuel they need to work and to create energy. You've got higher levels of inflammation. And then you've got the impact that blood sugar has on hormones. So all of these things can have a huge impact on how you feel. How do we start to know if we might have insulin resistance, right? What are some of the signs and symptoms that you might be dealing with this? A big one is that kind of post-lunch crash where you feel very tired in the afternoon. And especially if you feel a bit tired or sleepy after you eat, that could be a sign of insulin resistance. You might have brain fog. You might have quite severe carb or sugar cravings. So I have patients who tell me like, I'm addicted to sugar. I'm addicted to bread. And the one that I'm always screening for is, do you get hangry? Right? When you get hangry, that's usually because you've got a bit of a low blood sugar situation, and that puts enormous stress on your brain and your body. And then the other thing is if you have gained weight, especially in your midsection, that puts you at higher risk and makes it more likely that you might have insulin resistance. So let's chat about who's at risk, because a lot of times when people hear the word insulin, they think about diabetes. And then their next thought is, well, I don't have diabetes, so I don't need to worry about insulin resistance. And I want you to stay tuned, because when we talk about testing, you're going to see that having normal blood sugar does not mean that you don't have insulin resistance. And I'll explain more in a few minutes. But the women that I see in my office who are often having insulin resistance and have no idea, they're very smart. They're often very health aware. They're interested in their health. They're trying to be as healthy as possible. They're also very busy, like most of us are. They're often high achieving. And because of all that, they are often skipping meals. They might push lunch to 2 p.m. because they're in meetings all day. And then they eat some celery and hummus and call it lunch. And spoiler alert, that's not lunch for a grown woman. You might be sitting a lot because of your work and your family obligations, right? I spent several hours sitting in an arena over the past weekend. If you have chronic stress, which a lot of us do, what's super interesting is that when we look at people who have the highest levels of stress, they have a 45% higher chance of having metabolic syndrome. So metabolic syndrome is this constellation of different things that affect your metabolism. And one of those includes blood sugar. The other ones are your blood pressure, your waist circumference, your cholesterol. So people who have higher levels of stress compared to low stress are at higher risk for some of this metabolic dysfunction. And what's interesting is that the type of stress that has the strongest impact is work stress. And to just make things even more difficult, women are more impacted than men by the factors that connect stress and blood sugar. We'll talk more about the nutrition piece, but this is something I'm always reassuring my patients. When I tell them they have insulin resistance, their first reaction is often like, but I don't eat sugar. And I'm like, this is way more complex than how much sugar you eat. Stress is a huge part of this. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. If you're not sleeping well, that puts you at higher risk. And then if you take certain medications, so especially corticosteroids like prednisone, certain antipsychotics, and then certain oral contraceptives or birth control pills. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't take them. It means that if you're on these medications, we need to have a plan in place to make sure that we are monitoring and protecting your blood sugar and your metabolic health. The other thing that puts us at risk is our age. So our insulin sensitivity, which is the opposite of resistance, right? We want our insulin to be sensitive, meaning we want it to work quickly and well. That goes down as we get older, and that starts in the third or fourth decade, and it continues through life. And a huge part of what's happening is, again, those muscles are becoming less sensitive to insulin, so your body's having to pump more and more insulin out. And then most people are also losing a lot of muscle mass as they get older, while at the same time gaining more visceral fat, which is the fat that lives in the abdomen, especially around the organs. As we get older, we're more at risk for this. And then let's throw in perimenopause for good measure. So what happens to a lot of women in perimenopause, similar to what I just talked about, you have more visceral or abdominal fat. You have some loss of muscle. Most women become more sedentary. So we have studies that show that on average, women take 3,000 fewer steps per day in perimenopause. We're more likely to have disrupted sleep, which causes more insulin resistance. And then we have the drop of estrogen, which also increases the risk. So some of the things that, like the specific risk factors that I'm looking for and things that I'm asking my patients about to see if they are at higher risk, especially if you are in perimenopause or menopause, would be a BMI over 25. Now, BMI is not perfect, so we're not going to only use that, but it is one of the things that we can use. One of the better predictors than BMI is your waist circumference. And if your waist circumference is greater than 31.5 inches, you're at higher risk. If it's greater than 35, you are at significantly higher risk. If you have a sedentary lifestyle, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but you can exercise and be sedentary. And what I mean by that is that you can exercise, but if the rest of the day you are sitting on your butt, you are actually sedentary. So we need to think about exercise and movement separately. We have done an exercise episode that you can go back and listen to, and we have another one coming up, which we'll get into this more. But just because you work out doesn't mean you're active. We need to also take our steps and move throughout the day. Again, age we talked about. If you're over 40, you're at higher risk. If you are non-Caucasian, so if you are not white, you have higher levels of a risk. If you have any history of having high blood pressure or cardiovascular disease, especially if you had gestational diabetes or preeclampsia or high blood pressure in your pregnancy, you're at higher risk for the rest of your life. If you had gestational diabetes or high blood pressure, you're at higher risk for the rest of your life to get those again. And then if you also have PCOS, which is polycystic ovarian syndrome, this is a hormonal condition that is mostly driven by insulin resistance. I want to be very clear that when women are diagnosed with insulin resistance, often they feel like I've done something wrong. It like reinforces like, oh my God, I'm eating too much sugar. I'm not exercising. Now, there are lots of things that you can do or not do, which would increase your risk. But if you just listen to all the things I've talked about, there's a lot of things happening, especially if you're in that perimenopause window. There's a lot of changes happening around the same time that all come together to increase your risk. So how do you know if you have insulin resistance, right? Maybe you just listen to that list and you're like, check, check, check. I have a lot of those risk factors. How do you actually find out? if you have insulin resistance. The first sign of insulin resistance is having high levels of insulin with normal glucose or normal blood sugar. And that's really important. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. And again, this is usually triggered by fat accumulation, especially in our midsections. This causes fat cells that are enlarged that cause more inflammation. And then that persistent inflammation makes insulin less effective, right? Less sensitive. It becomes more resistant. So to keep our blood sugar around that 4.8 that we talked about, you have to make more and more insulin in order to do that. And this is why testing is tricky, because again, by definition, insulin resistance means that your blood sugar is still normal, but that blood sugar does not tell us how much insulin was needed to keep your blood sugar in the range. I have patients all the time when we talk about this, they're like, oh no, I have my blood sugar test and it's fine. And I'm always like, that doesn't mean you don't have insulin resistance if they didn't test insulin, which it's not standard of care to check insulin. So let's chat about the blood test that you want to think about. And I'm going to throw out some numbers. Please don't panic to write these all down. In the show notes, I will link to my free lab guide, The Missing Piece. It has all of these tests and numbers included. So you will have access to all of these numbers. The first thing that we're looking at is your fasting blood sugar. So this would be your blood sugar after an overnight fast of at least 8 hours. And what we're looking for with our fasting blood sugar is we want your level ideally below 5.5, even though the normal, and I'm talking Canadian units here, I'll talk about US in a moment, normal blood sugar for fasted is under 6. But if you are between 5.5 and 6, or if you're over 100 for the US units, that tells us that your pancreas is having a hard time regulating your blood sugar. That's what that morning blood sugar looks at. So again, normal is technically 6. Anything above 5.6 makes it likely, or makes it more likely, that you would have insulin resistance. But again, your blood sugar can be perfectly normal because, again, technically anywhere between 5.6 and 5.9 is considered normal. It's only if you go above 6 that then you get pushed into the prediabetes. So you can be normal and have insulin resistance. And the way that we would tell that is by ideally also measuring insulin at the same time as we measure your blood sugar. And if your fasted insulin is greater than 76, you're at higher risk. And certainly if it's above like 100, you're at even higher risk. Even though, again, technically the normal amount of insulin, if you look at a lab report, will go all the way usually up to like 183. Once you have those two numbers, you have your fasted blood sugar and your fasting insulin, we can pull up a calculator, which calculates something called HOMA-IR. The IR stands for insulin resistance. And you plug in your fasting blood sugar and your fasting insulin, and it gives you this score, this HOMA-IR score. And if that score is higher than 2.5, it means that you are at a higher risk of insulin resistance. The next test is hemoglobin A1C, or HbA1c, or some people just call it A1C. And the current guidelines show that if that number is under 6, you are considered normal. Again, if you go over 6, that's where you get pushed into prediabetes. However, there is some debate about this number. Some societies suggest that our A1C, if it is greater than 5.7, you have insulin resistance, even though, again, technically, that is considered normal. Some labs have started reporting this way, which I really appreciate. If your A1C is above 5.5, you are at higher risk for insulin resistance. So there's kind of this like space between ideal average blood sugar, and I don't think I said that. Hemoglobin A1C is your average blood sugar for the last 3 months. And if you're wondering how the heck they measure that, hemoglobin, or red blood cells, hemoglobin is in the red blood cells live 90 days. So by measuring something in there, we can estimate what your blood sugar was over the last 3 months. Ideally, you want that number, that A1C, under 5.5. If you are 5.6 to 5.9, you are considered higher risk, and there's almost guaranteed to be insulin resistance at that level. If that number goes above 6, that puts you into prediabetes. By looking at all of these numbers together, we can really start to get a sense of whether or not you have insulin resistance. And again, I want to reiterate this. You may have had your blood sugar checked and been told everything is normal, and that may be technically true, and that does not mean that you don't have insulin resistance. Because if any of your numbers are kind of in those higher ends, and especially if insulin hasn't been measured, which it probably hasn't, we don't know for sure that your blood sugar is actually ideal. Are you tired of being told everything is normal, even though you're exhausted and don't feel like yourself? You deserve better care than that. In my one-on-one practice, I help women just like you do a deep dive to figure out what's really draining your energy. Together, we'll get answers and create a clear, personalized plan to help you start feeling like yourself again. If you live in Ontario or the Outaouais region and you're ready for the next step, visit drsarahv.ca to learn more and book your appointment today. Because being tired all the time isn't normal, and you don't have to keep pushing through it. The next thing we can look at is your cholesterol. Almost everyone gets their cholesterol levels checked, and there's 2 markers of your cholesterol that reflect what's happening with insulin resistance. The first one are your triglycerides. If triglycerides are above 1.7, if you're fasted, that is a sign that you probably have insulin resistance, because triglycerides go up as a result of insulin resistance. And then if you have low HDL, so HDL is your good cholesterol, if you have low HDL, that is often also a reflection of insulin resistance. And what's super interesting about HDL, that's often one of the first markers that will be affected, especially in very young people. Like, it's often the first sign that there's something going on metabolically, even if still everything else is normal. A lot of times we kind of brush off low cholesterol, like people get told, well, just do more exercise. Yes, that could be helpful, but it also might be a signal that there's other stuff brewing that maybe hasn't developed enough that we can see it, but we need to be mindful. If you have low HDL, you're probably at higher risk of insulin resistance. This is why these numbers, and I know you're probably like, I didn't remember any of those. You don't, it's not a memory test. I will send you my guide. But this is why I joke that labs are my love language, because I cannot tell you how often a woman is told everything is normal. And when we request her blood work, again, it is factually true that things are normal. She may not have a full-blown disease, but I can see right away that she's on the path. She's on the insulin resistance path. And if we don't take her off that path, there's a very strong likelihood that she may eventually become pre-diabetic or diabetic. This is why I encourage all women to know your numbers, because these numbers often will tell you that something is brewing while you can still do something about it. We also want to look at body composition. So I said earlier that if your waist circumference is higher than 32, you are at higher risk. If we're looking at white women, you have higher risk above 32 inches, and you have significantly higher risk if your waist measurement is more than 35 inches. If we're looking at Asian women, so South Asian, Chinese, Japanese, you have a higher risk under 32 inches, and that is similar for Hispanic women. And then for Black women, we ideally want a lower cutoff point as well. So Black women's risk will also go up sooner, which is a waist circumference of about 32 to 33 inches. And your waist circumference is actually the best predictor of future insulin resistance, even more than your blood sugar, right? So this is a measurement that most people can do in the comfort of their own home. I'll put the instructions to how to do it properly in the show notes. You literally measure your waist You could also do a waist to hip, which is really helpful. But the more weight you carry in your midsection, that is a huge predictor of your likelihood of developing insulin resistance. Another thing that you want to pay attention for, I haven't seen this as much, but I actually diagnosed a patient just based on this. She thought I was the smartest person around, but it's something called acanthosis nigricans. And what this is a skin condition. And what we see is dark, thickened, almost like velvety patches on your skin that usually appear in the creases in the folds. So it can be in the neck, the armpits, that's where my patient had it, or in your groin. So they're often more pigmented, so a black or a brown. And again, they might feel a little bit rough, a little bit warty. It often looks almost like a little dirty stain on your skin that you cannot get off. If you have this, if you have acanthosis nigricans, it nearly doubles your risk of having insulin resistance. So those are some of the things that you can look out for. Those are some of the tests that you can ask your doctor for to see if you do have insulin resistance. And the other thing that's very popular right now, again, are these CGMs or continuous glucose monitors. I would not recommend that to see if you have insulin resistance. Again, it's most helpful for people who are overtly diabetic. And the first 14 days are not actually reflective of your average blood sugar when you use one of these machines. So this is what happened to me. This was when I was deep in my sleep obsession. And I was like, it's got to be my blood sugar. I'm hypoglycemic at night. And so I slapped on a CGM, and sure enough, it was dropping overnight. And I was like, hallelujah, I have figured out the problem. I've solved it. And then one of my colleagues was just like, by the way, these things are not really accurate in the first 14 days. And I was like, dang it. So if you're going to use one, you need to use it for more than 14 days. And again, unless you have overt prediabetes or diabetes, it's not necessary or helpful. It usually just creates fear and panic around things that are perfectly normal. Now we know what insulin resistance is. We know how to test for it and find out if we have it. Now, this is some advice for people who have insulin resistance or for people who want to prevent insulin resistance. The thing with insulin resistance is you're early on the path, right? You're on the early part of the path, which means you can turn around and walk off the path. The longer you stay on the path, and once you get into diabetes, so I should have said this earlier. So insulin resistance is lots of insulin, but blood sugar is still in check. Prediabetes is lots of insulin, but now blood sugar is starting to come over the edge. It's starting to be a bit higher than what it should be. Diabetes is either loss of insulin function because the pancreas literally cannot keep up, or it's that your blood sugar now is out of control. Like there's no amount of insulin that's keeping your blood sugar in control, and that's where we definitely want to medicate. A lot of what we're going to talk about is very modifiable. Some of this is not in your control, like your age. You might have some genetic risk factors. You might have PCOS or some other reason why you're at higher risk, but there's a lot you can do. The first place that people always think about, right, is nutrition. I got to stop eating sugar. I actually don't recommend that for a few different reasons. Number one, it's unlikely that how much sugar you eat is the only factor. It might be part of it. And certainly if you're eating a lot of processed sugar, you should absolutely reduce that. But we want to think more globally about our diet. We want to think, what are the things that are going to help to stabilize my blood sugar? The two big ones are going to be your protein, fiber, and healthy fats. But before we even get to what you're eating, the place that I usually start is when are you eating? Because most of us are trying to optimize what we're eating, and we don't even have the basics down because you're not even eating 3 regular meals per day at some kind of consistent time. I always start with regular meals, ideally 3 meals a day, snacks if you need them, so that you're getting a consistent source of energy. And one of the questions I was asked as I was preparing for this episode is like, when is the best time of a day to have a treat in terms of getting the best glucose response? The time of day where you are most insulin sensitive is in the morning. This is why it's a great idea to eat breakfast. When you do intermittent fasting and all your food comes in the later part of the day, you're less insulin sensitive in the later part of the day. So I'm a big fan of a big, healthy robust breakfast with protein and fiber and healthy fat. But if you want to have something a little bit sweeter, you are better off from a blood sugar perspective to have it earlier in the day and potentially just eating it after a meal as opposed to on its own. The other thing that we talked about earlier is the importance of movement. We all know that strength training is good for us. Now, one of the reasons I want you to think about why strength training matters is that the more muscle you have, the more, like the bigger your sponge is to take in that glucose that's going up after you eat. And you also need to move that muscle, right? You can't just do your strength training twice a week and spend the other 99% of your week sitting down. It needs to be both. We need to build that muscle. We got to move that muscle. And walking after you eat is really helpful for preventing some of those big rises in blood sugar. Again, your blood sugar should go up after you eat. If we don't want it to go too high outside of normal, walking is very helpful for that. Sleep. If you are getting less than 7 hours of good quality sleep, you're going to have a harder time managing your blood sugar. End of story. Stress. We talked about this earlier. Workplace stress, especially for women, is not great for our blood sugar. And the thing that's fascinating about stress is that it is an independent risk factor for insulin resistance. Now, what that means is that you could be eating your 3 very healthy meals every day. You could be doing your strength training and going for your walks and getting all your movement in and sleeping. Even if you're doing all of that, if you have high levels of stress, that could raise your blood sugar and your insulin resistance. So how that works is that when you get stressed, there's a whole cascade of hormones released, the end of which is cortisol. So this is where people get, interested in cortisol. Cortisol matters. When you get stressed, you make more cortisol. And cortisol is getting you ready to get a handle on whatever is going on with your stress. So it's helping to push you into this fight or flight. And part of what you need if you're going to fight someone or if you're going to run away is you need your muscles to have fuel. Cortisol causes your blood sugar to go up so that you can literally run, fight, think, and make good decisions. Now, the problem for most of us is that we have stress sitting at our desk, usually in the form of an email or a spreadsheet. We have a huge release of cortisol to get us to run or fight. We don't do either of those because we wouldn't last very long in our jobs. So there's absolutely nowhere for that blood sugar to go. So it gets packaged up as fat, triglycerides, and stored in your midsection, in your muscles, on your liver. Figuring out how to healthily manage your stress is a key part of managing insulin resistance. And this is also why regular meal times are so important. Because again, one of the biggest stresses on your brain is when it sees your blood sugar going down and there is no food coming. So when your brain doesn't know, am I getting lunch? What time am I getting lunch? What is lunch? Is lunch a granola bar again today? Because that really is not cutting it for me. If you are under fueling, your brain freaks out, triggers a stress response, and again releases cortisol because cortisol helps to bring your blood sugar back up. So one of the best ways to reduce the amount of stress on your body is literally to eat regular meals throughout the day. I know it's so boring, but most of us are not doing the basic boring things. And we're looking for fancy ways to make things better when we wouldn't need all the fancy stuff if we did the boring basics. Next up is supplements and medications. So one of the things that's really interesting, and this is something we've been talking about a lot in the obesity fellowship that I am a part of this year, is when do we intervene and how do we decide who to intervene for? Because insulin resistance is not yet treated, right? Even if you have prediabetes, you don't get medications, which is, I find silly because we know that a good percentage of people who are pre-diabetic will eventually become diabetic. So we're basically waiting for people to become diabetic. And then we say, oh, you're diabetic, let's throw you on some meds. If we were paying attention, we would have seen this happening over years, if not decades. We would see the fasting blood sugar slowly creeping up, the A1C slowly creeping up, the triglyceride, we can see this coming if we are paying attention. And again, if we see that you are progressing on the path, I don't want to wait for you to cross the diabetes threshold before we tell you, number one, that this is happening, and before we decide to give you something. I tell people when I see signs of insulin resistance, we talk about all the different ways that we can help reverse or reduce that. But one of the things that I just want to specifically highlight is that some of the best candidates for those GLP-1 medications, your Ozempic, your Wegovy's, is that if we give that to someone with prediabetes, we significantly reduce the risk of them becoming diabetic. But right now, they are approved for diabetes, not prediabetes. But if you are obese or overweight, and we are seeing signs of insulin resistance, you may still qualify for those medications. So that's actually a condition where we know that giving those meds in prediabetes before the diabetes comes is preventative medicine. And then one of the other questions we received was like, how does HRT affect insulin resistance? What do hormones do with all of this? Hormone replacement therapy has been associated with a significant increase in insulin sensitivity. Again, that's what we want. We want it to be sensitive. That's the opposite of resistance. But the type of HRT is important. Most of the benefit is coming from estrogen. And when we add synthetic progestins, so not progesterone, not your, oral micronized progesterone, the little balls, those are fine. If we add progestin, and specifically a type of progestin called MPA, which is found in things like Depo-Provera, Provera, and Prempro, although those, I don't see a lot of women taking those, but they're still around, that would not have the same beneficial impact if you have that synthetic progestin. If we look at kind of like from a broader metabolic perspective, if we give postmenopausal women who are somewhere between the ages of 50 to 59, if we give them estrogen, it has been shown to reduce their fat mass, improve bone mineral density, preserve fat-free mass, and reduce the risk of type 2 diabetes. Women who are on HRT have been observed to have about a 30% reduced chance of becoming diabetic or developing diabetes. However, currently, based on the evidence we have, I know that sounds all very positive, it's not currently recommended to take it only for that purpose. So if you are taking it for other purposes, hot flashes and night sweats, bone density, vaginal changes, so GSM, you can have those benefits. But right now, we don't recommend to take it only for that. That may change, but those are the guidelines right now. If we think about our energy wealth framework, right, we're trying to put deposits into our body, brain, heart, and spirit. I've just given you lots of different things that you can do to keep those energy accounts topped up, specifically in a way that's going to help to keep your blood sugar in check. So I want to go over a couple kind of common mistakes that I see before we wrap up. When I tell a woman insulin resistance, her first reaction is almost always, okay, I just got to stop eating sugar. I'm not going to eat so much sugar. Again, if you are eating processed sugar, so processed sugar is anything from a package, okay? This is not your banana, it's not your fruit, it's not your potato, your carrots. This is packaged. We ideally want our packaged sugars to be under 25 grams a day. I can tell you that's not very much. That is a good thing to pay attention to. Like, how much added packaged sugar am I taking in, and can I reduce that? And for most of us, the answer is yes. However, I don't recommend cutting all sugar out. Number one, because that is not necessary, but also for a lot of women, as soon as we say, I can't have sugar, our brain will never stop thinking about sugar. And you're often just actually increasing your cravings and your desire. Even if you are insulin resistant, you do not need to cut all carbs. You do not need to cut all sugar. I know I am one person. I literally eat chocolate every single day, and I have wonderful blood sugar control because I do all the other stuff, right? I strength train, I walk, I manage my stress, I sleep, I eat well. So this is not a you cannot have sugar. That's an oversimplification of what's going on. You also don't want to overfast or skip meals. I've talked about this before. It causes so much stress. If you drop into low blood sugar, you're actually triggering a reaction that often brings your blood sugar up higher than you want it. So eat your 3 meals a day. And then don't fall into one of the biggest traps that women have around their health, which is the all or nothing thinking, right? I'm never going to eat bread again. I'm not going to eat sugar. I'm going to strength train. I'm going to change 18 things. I'm starting tomorrow. That's not going to happen. It's also not necessary. Pick one or two things that you think are going to move the needle and focus on those. And then we can add if we need to. Okay. And then also don't ignore what you're noticing. So if you're noticing, I've gained a lot of weight in my midsection, I'm having these big energy crashes, I'm having more of these dark skin or skin tags. And talk about skin tags. Skin tags can also be a sign of insulin resistance. Make sure that you're going for your annual testing, right? Your doctor may not offer it, but try to go in at least every year or two to get these numbers checked on. If you have insulin resistance, it's not because you're doing something wrong. It's that the ensemble of your genetics and your behaviors have put you on this path. Again, the sooner you know you're on the path, the sooner you can get people to support and help you to figure out, how do I reverse course and get back to a different path? Because this is not the path I want to be on. And a huge part of why people feel tired with insulin resistance is, again, you've got all this energy floating around in your bloodstream, but your body and your cells are starved for energy. Again, especially if you're struggling with the physical fatigue and the mental fatigue, we need to make sure that your body and your brain are getting the fuel that they need. The next steps I'm going to invite you to do, one is pull out your last set of tests that you had. And then I want you to go grab my lab guide, The Missing Piece, and I want you to compare your levels to the ideal levels, especially for your fasting blood sugar, your triglycerides, your A1C. All those numbers that you want to aim for are in that guide. And then if you haven't had blood work in a while, let this be your reminder to go do that. Last but not least, if you live in Ontario or in the Outaouais region and you want someone who can support you and walk with you on this path, who can explain your labs, who can help you figure out what you can do to treat or reverse insulin resistance, I would be honored to work with you and support you on that journey. That was my longer than I wanted conversation about insulin resistance, but it's such an important conversation because, again, it's very common. A lot of people don't know they have it, and there's so much we can do to reduce and reverse it. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you right back here in 2 weeks. I know your time is precious, so it means so much to me that you're here. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a woman in your life who could use a little extra energy and encouragement today. It's a small way to show her you care, because we're all in this together. Wondering what the next step is? Find out what's really draining your energy by taking my fatigue fingerprint quiz at fatiguefixer.ca/quiz. You'll discover which of the 5 most common types of fatigue you're dealing with, like frazzled fatigue, where your body's exhausted but your mind won't turn off, or drained fatigue, where no amount of sleep ever feels like enough. Your results will include recommended labs to ask your doctor about, plus my top suggestions for habits and practices that can help you start feeling more rested, calm, and in control. Because here's the thing, being tired all the time isn't normal, and you deserve to feel like yourself again. And hey, if you've got a story to share, a question, or just something on your mind, leave me a voicemail. Your voice might even make it into a future episode. Thanks again for listening, and remember, it's not all in your head. I believe you, and we'll figure this out together. I'll see you right back here in 2 weeks.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.